Silence had always been a language Piccolo understood better than speech. On the sacred world of the Kais, where golden grass moved beneath an endless sky and old winds carried the weight of creation itself, he sat in meditation without motion, without distraction, without the smallest fracture in his focus. Time drifted around him like a slow river. Breath entered and left his body with perfect control. Thought dissolved. Intention narrowed. He had come to this place to refine the distance between power and purpose, because strength without discipline was only another kind of weakness, and in every universe that truth remained the same. Then the silence screamed. It began as a tremor beneath reality, so subtle that lesser beings would have mistaken it for a passing distortion in the air. Piccolo felt it instantly. His eyes opened. The sky above him bent inward, folding like cloth caught in an invisible fist. Light tore apart. Space twisted. Before he could rise, the world itself split open in a violent ring of black and violet radiance, and a force unlike any Kai he had sensed dragged him from the ground, as if the universe had chosen him for some unread judgment. There was no time to resist. The rupture swallowed him whole. For one impossible moment there was only pressure, endless and crushing, as though he had been thrown between the gears of creation. Then came movement. A plunge through cold dimensions that had no stars, no direction, no mercy. Images flashed past him in broken shards. Towers of glass, red lights, crowded streets, billboards the size of mountains, voices layered over voices, laughter manufactured for screens, fear hidden under noise. Then gravity seized him again and the blackness vanished. Piccolo emerged high above a city he had never seen before. Night had not yet fallen, but the sky was gray with smoke, and below him stretched a vast metallic wilderness of skyscrapers, bridges, and streets clogged with human life. The city pulsed with tension. Sirens wailed from every direction. Helicopters circled like insects. Giant screens wrapped around buildings and displayed smiling faces with perfect teeth, shining costumes, and slogans written in colors so bright they seemed to insult the misery beneath them. The air itself felt wrong, not weak but poisoned. Not by gas or ash alone, but by vanity, by performance, by a strange hollowness where courage should have lived. His senses expanded and the truth hit him all at once. Panic, screaming civilians, structural collapse, explosions timed too neatly, camera crews already in place. A rescue operation, if it could be called that, was unfolding several blocks away, but the energy around it carried the rhythm of theater, not heroism. Piccolo turned toward the source and saw the center of the disaster. A cluster of high-rise buildings had partially collapsed after what appeared to be a superpowered attack or catastrophic mishap. Concrete slabs had crushed vehicles into the pavement. Entire floors sagged over the street like broken jaws. Men and women were trapped beneath steel and glass. Children cried from shattered windows. Smoke poured upward in black pillars. And standing amid the carnage, dressed in polished colors, were figures of immense power behaving with astonishing emptiness. One man in a blue suit and flag-draped cape hovered above the street with the posture of a king waiting for applause. Another posed near a crushed bus while cameras caught his profile. A woman barked at a production assistant rather than helping the bleeding family beside her. Orders were being shouted, but not to save the wounded. They were arranging angles, managing optics, delaying action until the scene looked right. Piccolo watched for less than a second. That was all the judgment he needed. He descended like a green streak through the smoke, and the first thing anyone below noticed was the wind. It swept across the avenue in a circular burst, scattering dust, ash, and broken paper into the air. Reporters turned. Civilians stared upward through tears and blood. The seven paused in visible confusion. Before anyone could speak, Piccolo raised one hand. The leaning facade of a 30-story building stopped falling. Steel groaned. Rubble shivered. Thousands of tons of concrete hung in the air as if an invisible mountain had caught it from below. Gasps spread through the street in a wave. Piccolo did not look at the cameras. He did not announce himself. He did not pose. His gaze moved only toward the trapped and the dying. With his other hand, he split his focus. Entire slabs of wreckage rose gently from the streets, lifted by precise telekinetic force that never crushed, never slipped, never trembled. Families penned under debris suddenly found daylight opening above them. Ambulances, delayed and overwhelmed moments earlier, were given clear paths through the wreckage as vehicles slid aside without drivers. A crumbling support beam threatening to bury a line of firefighters dissolved into dust under a single kickback no larger than a coin. A ruptured gas main was sealed by a narrow burst of heat. Glass rained upward instead of down. The impossible was happening so quickly that the human mind could not sort miracle from method. Then came the children on the 12th floor. Their school bus had been thrown halfway into a collapsed parking structure, its rear crushed, its front dangling over an open void. News drones hovered nearby to capture what would have been a perfect tragedy for evening broadcasts. The caped man with the bright smile had been preparing to make the save on camera. Piccolo reached the bus first. He vanished from the street and reappeared in the broken structure with such speed that the air cracked behind him. One hand pressed against the bus frame. The other shielded the children from falling debris. He lowered the vehicle through the open face of the building as gently as a parent setting a child into bed. Tires touched pavement without a jolt. The children stumbled out sobbing, and for the first time since arriving in this world, Piccolo knelt. "You are safe," he told them. Nothing in his voice asked for gratitude. Nothing in it trembled with performance. It was simply true. The city seemed to feel the difference. People who had spent years watching costumed saviors on screens, people trained by tragedy and advertising to expect spectacle before compassion, now witnessed something they had never been sold because it could not be sold. A warrior with monstrous power and no hunger to be seen. A being who moved through catastrophe like a storm guided by conscience. A protector who never once checked whether the cameras were still recording. And they were recording everything. Helicopter footage caught him holding two collapsing buildings apart long enough for hundreds to escape through the center. Street cameras captured him redirecting an entire section of a freeway overpass before it crushed the evacuation route. Phone videos spread instantly, each one more unbelievable than the last. In one clip, he shielded paramedics from a secondary explosion with a transparent barrier of light. In another, he floated above the avenue surrounded by fire and smoke, arms extended, while the rubble of half a city district hung suspended around him like obedient moons. The seven could do nothing but watch. Some were stunned, some were offended, some were afraid, but none of them could match what was happening in front of them. Their rehearsed authority had been broken in a single instant, not by a louder hero, but by a better one. When the final tremor passed and the last major collapse had been prevented, Piccolo slowly lowered the debris into stable positions and stepped onto a ruined section of asphalt. Around him, rescue crews rushed forward at last, now free to do the work they should have been doing from the beginning. Civilians stared as if afraid he might vanish if they blinked. Reporters shouted questions that struck him as meaningless noise. "Who are you? Where are you from? Are you joining the Seven? Are you with Vought?" Piccolo ignored them all. His senses moved beyond the ruined street and into the larger city, measuring suffering like heat across a battlefield. There were crimes unfolding elsewhere. Hidden violence. This world had wounds deeper than broken buildings. He could feel them already. The caped blonde finally floated down to street level, smile absent now. Eyes locked on Piccolo with the carefully controlled intensity of a predator denied its prey. For a moment the city held its breath. The famous hero looked at the green stranger who had stolen the scene, stolen the admiration, stolen the one thing he valued more than power itself. Piccolo met his gaze with calm disinterest, as though he were looking not at a god, but at a loud child. Then he rose into the air and left. No speech. No slogan. No interview. He ascended through the smoke and vanished between the towers while below, every camera in America chased the shrinking silhouette of the silent warrior. The story spread faster than the disaster itself. Newsrooms abandoned scheduled programming. Social media exploded. Talk shows collapsed into stunned speculation. By the time night covered the city, the entire world had seen the stranger. They called him many things in those first hours. At Vought Tower, analysts scrubbed the footage frame by frame with growing dread. Thermal mapping showed no known energy signature. Blood trace estimates from debris samples revealed biology unlike anything in their databases. Facial recognition returned nothing. Military records returned nothing. Intelligence agencies returned nothing. He had appeared from nowhere, displayed power beyond any registered soup on earth, and vanished before an offer could be placed in front of him. In a private screening room high above the city, Homelander watched the footage alone. He did not blink when Piccolo lifted the building. He did not move when civilians ran past the cameras without praising the Seven. He sat in stillness as clip after clip replayed the same unbearable truth. The world had looked at someone else today, and it had done so with real awe. Not purchased admiration. Not patriotic branding. Not fear disguised as love. Something cleaner. Something deeper. Something he had never been able to force. For the first time in years, Homelander felt small. Elsewhere in the tower, a senior Vought analyst finished the last layer of biochemical comparison, then went pale and called for immediate executive clearance. The report was short. The implications were not. The unknown warrior possessed no trace of Compound V. Morning came to the city like a nervous afterthought. The smoke had thinned, but the mood had not. Across every screen in America, the same images continued to replay with devotional obsession. The green warrior descending through ash. The bus lowered from the shattered structure. The impossible stillness on his face while chaos bent around his hands. News anchors spoke his existence into the language of markets, polling shifts, and brand disruption, but none of their polished phrases could contain what people had actually felt while watching him. For one terrible and beautiful moment, they had seen power separated from vanity, and once that distinction had been made, it was difficult to unsee. Vought moved quickly, because Vought always moved quickly when reality threatened the story it sold. The first offers were discreet, secure line, private envoys, luxury apartments left unoccupied for his convenience, access to resources, citizenship, a narrative package ready to be assembled the moment he agreed to participate in it. They tracked unusual energy signatures, unexplained rescues, and eyewitness reports from every borough until they found him sitting in meditation on the roof of an abandoned cathedral overlooking the river. He had chosen the place because it was quiet, damaged, and forgotten, which made it more honest than most of the city. The executives arrived with smiles that had been approved by committees. They told him the world needed symbols. They told him people trusted heroes more when those heroes stood together. They told him he could save more lives with Vought than without it. They spoke of logistics, influence, partnerships, the chance to reshape history from inside the institution. One woman placed a tablet before him that displayed projected approval ratings in 40 countries. Another outlined his potential compensation package. A third mentioned global fame with the practiced softness of someone offering medicine to the sick. Piccolo listened without interruption. When they were finished, he opened his eyes and asked a single question. How many people died yesterday while your heroes waited for the cameras to find them? The rooftop went still. The woman with the tablet tried first. She said the situation had been complex. The man beside her blamed structural unpredictability. Another insisted that public confidence required visible leadership during crises. Their words curled around the truth like smoke around a corpse. Piccolo let them speak until they ran out of professionally acceptable lies. Then he stood. I do not need your money, he said. I do not want your fame, and I will never belong to anyone who treats suffering like a performance. There was no rage in his voice. That made it worse. They tried again with a different tactic. Membership in the Seven, access to satellite, intelligence feeds, international mobility. He cut through each offer before it could harden into another manipulation. To him, the entire structure was transparent. He had known tyrants, demons, emperors, and gods drunk on their own image. This corporation did not frighten him because it was powerful. It disturbed him because it was petty. It had taken humanity's desire for protection and turned it into an advertisement. The delegation left in failure, but not without warning him that this world was more complicated than he understood. Piccolo remained on the cathedral roof long after they were gone, looking over the city as if trying to hear the heartbeat beneath its noise. He had sensed the same truth the night before and felt it more clearly now. Earth and his universe had always struggled with violence, pride, and fear, but it had also possessed fighters, teachers, and guardians who stood between darkness and the innocent. This world had outsourced that sacred duty to branding. Here, strength had become product. Heroism had become theater. Even the people seemed trapped in a cycle of worship and disappointment, desperate to believe in protectors and equally certain those protectors would fail them. He began to move through the city in silence. No one knew where he slept. No one knew where he would appear next. He stopped muggings before victims realized they'd been targeted. He pulled trafficked children from hidden apartments and left their captors unconscious beside police precinct doors. He extinguished tenement fires from blocks away with precise waves of compressed air. He stood between abusive men and the women they believed they owned. He intercepted a hijacked armored truck by catching it with one hand before it reached a crowded intersection. Every act was clean, uncelebrated. He disappeared before gratitude could become an audience. But people always watched. Among them was Annie January, known to the public as Starlight, who had spent years trying to preserve something decent inside a machine designed to strip decency from everything it touched. She saw the footage first like everyone else, but unlike the others, she could not shake what it did to her. There was no calculation in him, no hunger to be adored, no private rot hidden beneath a public smile. When she finally saw him in person from a distant rooftop, stopping an armed robbery without striking a fatal blow and then leaving before the cameras arrived, she felt a painful, quiet question rise inside her. If this was what a real hero looked like, then what had she been helping maintain all this time? Huey felt a different kind of pull. To him, the green stranger looked less like a savior and more like a flaw in the system, the kind of impossible variable that made monsters nervous. He watched stolen surveillance clips with Butcher in dim safe houses and half-abandoned offices trying to understand what they were seeing. Butcher trusted nothing, least of all anything powerful enough to humble Vought, yet even he could not hide his fascination. The alien did not act like a soup. He had no appetite for status, no visible weakness for temptation, no interest in intimidation for its own sake. He behaved, quite maddeningly, like a man with principles. That made him dangerous in an entirely different way. Because if he was genuine, then he represented something worse than another weapon. He represented comparison. And comparison could destroy empires faster than explosives. No one felt that more sharply than Homelander. At first his obsession dressed itself as curiosity. He demanded every scrap of footage, every witness statement, every estimate of the alien's power. He watched him lift bridges, stop bullets, and vanish from interviews. He studied the way civilians looked at him, not with conditioned awe, but with relief. It was that expression that lodged like glass in his mind. Relief suggested trust. Trust suggested safety. Safety suggested a kind of authority Homelander had never really possessed, despite all the flags and slogans draped over his shoulders. He could make the world kneel, but could he make it feel safe? The question poisoned him. In public, he laughed off the newcomer. In private, he raged at reports showing approval spikes for an unidentified alien who had never signed a contract. When Vought focus groups revealed that people described the stranger as calming, noble, and real, Homelander crushed the tablet in his hand without realizing he was doing it. The word followed him through the halls of the tower like a ghost. And while they all watched him, Piccolo watched humanity. He listened from rooftops and alleyways, from church steps and apartment ledges, from dark parks where the city sounded most honest. He heard workers speak of being abandoned after industrial accidents caused by corporate shortcuts. He heard mothers whisper about children harmed by reckless supers who faced no consequences. He heard police dismiss victims when the powerful were involved. He heard reporters rehearsing false narratives before evidence had even arrived. The pattern was everywhere. Humanity was not being destroyed by monsters falling from the sky. It was being hollowed out from within by greed protected by spectacle. The more he learned, the less he despised the ordinary people who clung to false heroes. They were not foolish. They were starved. A starving people would mistake imitation for nourishment if it was all they had ever been offered. One evening, as neon reflected across rain-soaked streets, Piccolo found himself standing above Times Square, looking down at giant screens that now argued over whether he was friend or threat. Panels of experts debated his origins. Poll numbers rolled beneath his image. Ad campaigns quietly adjusted to account for his existence. Even resistance was being monetized. He closed his eyes and extended his senses deeper into the city. Under the noise he found fear. Not simple fear of disaster. Older fear. The kind that made entire populations accept lies because lies felt stable. The kind that taught people to celebrate strength even when that strength abused them, because at least abuse was predictable. This world did not merely lack guardians. It had forgotten how to imagine them. A sonic boom split the night. People below looked up, cheering before they even knew why. The reaction was automatic, conditioned by years of spectacle. But Piccolo did not need sight to identify the presence descending toward him. The aura was arrogant, volatile, and deeply lonely, like a child pretending to be thunder. Homelander hovered above the tower line, cape swaying in the electric wind, eyes glowing red against the rain. No cameras had been invited. No handlers followed. For the first time since the Green Warrior appeared, the most famous man on Earth had come without an audience. Good, Piccolo thought. That meant whatever came next would be honest. Homelander smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. So, he said, you are the one everybody keeps talking about. The city beneath them did not know yet that history had chosen a rooftop for its latest judgment. Rain moved sideways in the high wind, hissing across glass towers and steel ledges while traffic far below crawled through neon reflections like blood through capillaries. Homelander hovered with effortless arrogance, chin raised, shoulders loose, every inch of him radiating the confidence of a man who had never truly been denied. He had arrived without cameras, but the performance had not left him. Men like him did not need an audience to act. They had become their own stage. Piccolo stood on the edge of the building with arms folded inside his cape, looking not impressed, not afraid, but faintly tired, as if he had anticipated that this conversation would eventually abandon the language of words. You have caused a great deal of confusion, Homelander said. People do not like confusion. People do not like lies, Piccolo replied. The answer landed harder than an insult because it contained no effort. Homelander's smile thinned. You think you understand this world because you lifted a few buildings and glared at some executives. You do not. These people need symbols. They need someone strong enough to carry their fear. You mean someone loud enough to hide it, Piccolo said. The rain seemed colder after that. For a moment, Homelander simply stared. In most rooms, in most countries, before most living beings, silence after his words belonged to fear. With Piccolo it belonged to judgment, and judgment was intolerable. It suggested equality at best, superiority at worst. The first attack came without warning because warning was for duels between warriors, and Homelander was not a warrior. He was an appetite in the shape of a man. Heat vision carved through the night in twin crimson lines bright enough to turn rain into steam. The beams slashed toward Piccolo's chest with enough force to split aircraft and cauterize flesh in the same instant. Piccolo moved an inch. The beams missed, shearing through a communications tower behind him and exploding it into molten fragments. Before the debris finished falling, Homelander crossed the distance between them. His fist drove forward with the force of a missile, fast enough to blur the air. Piccolo tilted his head and let it pass. An elbow followed, then a knee, then a storm of strikes so rapid the rooftop cracked beneath their shock waves. Homelander attacked with all the speed of instinct and all the grace of rage. A barrage meant not only to kill, but to assert dominance through sheer violence. Piccolo gave him neither satisfaction nor target. He turned. Redirected. Every movement was small, economical, humiliatingly calm. The tower shuddered under missed blows. Windows burst across 3 nearby buildings. Alarms erupted below as office floors lit up one by one. By the time people reached the glass and looked outward, the fight had already climbed into the sky. Now they saw it. 2 figures above Manhattan, one wrapped in blue and fury, the other in white cape and green stillness. Phone cameras lifted from sidewalks. News choppers altered course. Live streams ignited by the second. The secret confrontation ceased to be secret almost immediately, because power could hide many things, but not combat over a city. Homelander hated that. He drove Piccolo upward through the clouds with a shoulder charge that would have shattered tanks, only to find empty air where his opponent should have been. Piccolo reappeared above him and to the left, not striking, only observing. Heat vision flashed again, wider this time, sweeping through the clouds in a burning arc. Piccolo descended through the beam itself, aura flaring just enough to split the energy around him, then landed on nothing at all, standing in midair as calmly as if the sky had become stone. Fight back, Homelander snarled. "I am defending myself," Piccolo said. No sneer could have wounded more deeply. To Homelander, resistance made sense. Fear made sense. Pleading made sense. Even hatred was useful, because hatred still revolved around him. But pity was unbearable, and Piccolo had begun to look at him with something dangerously close to pity. Homelander attacked harder. The sonic booms from his movement rippled across the skyline. He hit Piccolo with enough force to shove him through 2 billboards in the upper floors of a luxury hotel. Guests screamed and fled as debris rained through marble corridors. Before Homelander could press the advantage, Piccolo caught the next punch in his palm. The impact thundered through the tower. Homelander's expression changed. It was small, almost invisible, but the world saw it on every zoomed-in screen and shaky live stream. Real surprise. The kind that appears when a lifetime of assumptions collides with a fact too solid to deny. Piccolo held his fist without strain. "Your power is considerable," he said, "but it has no center." Then he released the hand and stepped aside. Homelander crashed through a penthouse wall, tore through a sculpture garden, and recovered in a fury so intense that his face seemed less human than it had moments earlier. He roared and unleashed heat vision in a reckless sweep across the skyline. Piccolo moved faster than the cameras could follow, intercepting each beam with controlled bursts of Kai that redirected the blast away from civilians below. He was no longer merely avoiding harm to himself. He was protecting the city from the tantrum of the man trying to kill him. That realization spread through the viewers like ice. Commentators fell silent on live television. The narrative Vought had built for years began to crack under the simplest possible comparison. One fighter was trying to win. The other was trying to prevent collateral damage. The contrast was so naked that no script could bury it. Homelander felt the change in public emotion before any analyst did. Adoration was his native climate, and now the air itself seemed wrong. He charged again, this time grappling, trying to overpower through pure brutality. Their bodies slammed through the side of a tower and into an executive boardroom where a midnight meeting died in screams and scattering papers. Piccolo planted one foot, stopped their momentum, and pushed Homelander away with controlled force that sent him sliding through 3 walls. The two emerged from opposite sides of the building in a burst of smoke and shattered glass, then ascended into open air once more. Still, Piccolo did not attack. "Why?" Homelander demanded, voice cracking now with something deeper than anger. "Why are they looking at you like that?" Piccolo understood the question at once. Not because the words were clear, but because the wound behind them was. This was not a challenge about strength. It was a confession in disguise. "Because you want them to worship you," Piccolo said. "I only want them to live." The sentence hit harder than any blow of the night. Homelander screamed and came in blind. This time Piccolo moved first. Not to punish, not to humiliate, only to end it. He stepped inside the attack, turned with perfect timing, and took Homelander's arm at the wrist and shoulder. A shift of weight, a release of pressure in exactly the right direction. Homelander's balance vanished. His momentum betrayed him. In a single fluid motion, Piccolo disarmed the strike, spun him through empty air, and locked him motionless with 2 fingers at the base of his neck, a point where Ki and nerve met in precise disruption. The strongest man in this world froze instantly. The city saw its false god hanging helpless in the sky. No beam, no fist, no roar, just stillness. Piccolo held him there for several terrible seconds while helicopters circled at a distance and millions watched in disbelieving silence. He could have broken him then. The opening was complete. The gap between them, physical and emotional, stood exposed before the entire world. But Piccolo looked into Homelander's eyes and found not majesty, not courage, not even evil in its purest form. He found a hollow man terrified that love, given freely, might never belong to him. So Piccolo let him go. Homelander stumbled backward in the air, stunned less by the technique than by the mercy. "You are not a protector," Piccolo said quietly. "You are a frightened man playing one on television." Then he turned and descended toward the city, leaving Homelander suspended above Manhattan with rain on his face and shame burning hotter than his eyes ever had. By dawn, every screen on Earth would replay the same image. Homelander attacking in fury, Piccolo evading with calm. The effortless counter, the release. It was the mercy that ruined him. Defeat could be reframed. A temporary setback could be managed. But pity from a superior being, witnessed by the whole world, was something no marketing team could bleach clean. Inside Vought Tower, emergency meetings began before sunrise. Inside a sealed private chamber, Homelander watched the footage once. Then he ordered the room cleared. His face had become perfectly blank, which was how everyone around him knew he was closest to breaking. When the last person left, he picked up a secure phone and gave a quiet instruction that sent terror through the executive floor within minutes. If the alien would not kneel, Vought would eliminate him. Humiliation is one of the few injuries that power cannot anesthetize. It lingers. It metastasizes. It changes the logic of every decision made after it. In the weeks following Homelander's defeat over Manhattan, Vought did what frightened institutions always do when confronted by a truth they cannot control. It turned to secrecy, science, and the desperate belief that if nature would not produce the weapon it needed, then technology could counterfeit one. Publicly, the corporation reassured investors, launched damage control campaigns, and framed the aerial battle as an unfortunate misunderstanding between powerful personalities. Privately, entire departments vanished behind new security clearances. Facilities once used for classified soup development were emptied, expanded, and renamed. Budgets were rerouted through shell companies. Gene labs began operating around the clock beneath deserts, under mountains, and in black sites hidden inside ordinary industrial parks. The project received many internal labels during its earliest stages, but only one survived. Project Namekian. The logic behind it was simple in the way nightmares are simple. If the Green Warrior possessed power beyond Compound 5, then Vought would study the source of that power, replicate its biological architecture, and create an asset capable of surpassing him. Analysts harvested every fragment of data they could. Street debris from the first rescue. Atmospheric residue from his Kai blasts. Microscopic tissue traces lifted from concrete dust after the battle with Homelander. Medical algorithms compared the findings against everything in human genomics and found no meaningful correlation. Piccolo's biology was not an evolved branch of humanity. It was an entirely separate answer to life. That only made Vought want it more. Scientists were recruited not because they were ethical, but because they were willing. Genetic engineers who had once dreamed of curing disease now sat beneath fluorescent lights discussing how to splice alien cellular resilience with the mutagenic volatility of compound versus military consultants modeled battlefield outcomes. Behavioral specialists proposed methods for instilling loyalty before consciousness fully matured. Synthetic incubation tanks were built large enough to hold things no moral civilization would have imagined. Human subjects, many drawn from prisons, black-budget trafficking networks, or secret soup disposal pipelines, entered the labs and were not seen again. At first, the experiments failed in ordinary ways. Cells rejected foreign structures. Regenerative tissues consumed themselves. Compound V reacted to alien markers with explosive instability. Some subjects dissolved from the inside as their skeletal density outpaced organ adaptation. Others developed uncontrolled limb growth, distorted sensory arrays, or aggressive parasitic masses that burst through containment glass before dying in seconds. Entire research wings were sterilized and repopulated with new staff as if human lives could be reset by paperwork. Then the failures became less ordinary. One subject survived for 3 hours after receiving the 4th iteration. During that time, it displayed accelerated adaptation to pain, environmental learning through direct electromagnetic mimicry, and muscular hypertrophy so rapid that restraints cut through its arms like wire through clay. Another grew a second nervous system that appeared to think independently from the first. A third emitted bursts of unstable energy that erased electronic records within a 200-meter radius before tearing itself apart. Scientists stopped asking whether they were making a better soup. The more honest among them began asking whether they were creating a new category of life defined by permanent suffering. They kept going, because corporations are not haunted by what they do. Only the individuals inside them are. And haunted individuals can be replaced. Piccolo discovered the first laboratory by accident, though later he would wonder whether places soaked in enough pain become impossible for a disciplined mind not to hear. He had been tracking a pattern of disappearances linked to shell companies and unmarked transport routes. The clues were small: missing social workers, Night convoys carrying refrigerated materials to facilities that officially manufactured agricultural solvents. Security teams composed not of ordinary mercenaries, but enhanced personnel wearing no insignia. He followed the pattern to a remote complex built beneath a stretch of dead land, where even the wind seemed reluctant to linger. What he found there sickened him. The underground chambers were colder than tombs and cleaner than confession. Rows of suspended bodies floated inside nutrient tanks under dim green light, some recognizably human, others twisted into intermediate forms that looked as if evolution had been forced through a grinder. Files flashed across abandoned terminals detailing cellular graph schedules, behavioral suppression protocols, and energy projection estimates linked to a phrase repeated so often it might as well have been prayer. Namekian viability threshold. Piccolo moved through the facility in silence, each new room a sharper offense than the last. Vials labeled with his harvested biological markers sat beside barrels of compound V dissection suites contained bone structures grown to mimic his frame, then discarded when internal collapse rendered them useless. One chamber held audio logs from scientists debating whether alien consciousness could be engineered out of a being while retaining its combat instinct. Another stored recordings of failed subjects begging for death in languages they had not known before the experiments. He had faced tyrants who conquered worlds through force. He had battled monsters born from hatred, ambition, and old cosmic errors. Yet there was something uniquely vile about this. His peaceful race, a people of patience, wisdom, and spiritual discipline, had become the template for a line of biological weapons designed by profiteers. For the first time since arriving in this universe, Piccolo felt something close to personal shame. Not because he had committed these crimes. He knew that. But because his existence here had inspired them. His power had entered a rotten system, and the system had responded in the only language it knew. He destroyed the first laboratory in complete silence. Not with rage. Rage would have been too merciful. He disabled the power grid, evacuated the surviving subjects he could still save, sealed the lower specimen vaults, and collapsed the central research core with a focused blast that melted hard drives, gene maps, and synthetic growth matrices into shapeless slag. Security teams sent against him fell without fatal injury, disarmed before they could even raise alarms. By the time military response arrived, the complex was an empty ruin breathing smoke into the desert night. But destruction of one side only revealed the scale of the infection. There were more. Many more. Butcher brought the next proof personally. He found Piccolo standing on the roof of a freight terminal overlooking the river, city lights rippling across black water below. The Englishman approached with the posture of someone who preferred threats to requests and found neither sufficient for the moment. Huey waited several steps back, uncertain whether he was witnessing the beginning of an alliance or a disaster. Butcher lit a cigarette he never smoked and held a folder up between two fingers. Vought's breeding monsters, he said. Thought you ought to know they are not stopping at one lab. Piccolo said nothing. Butcher went on because silence unsettled him almost as much as honesty. He laid out what his people had stolen. Shipping manifests, security rosters, internal memos encrypted badly enough for Rage to decrypt them. Whatever Vought was building, it had already moved beyond simple replication. The project had become a doctrine. If they could not copy the alien exactly, they would manufacture something close enough to kill him and terrifying enough to control everyone else afterward. You want my help, Piccolo said at last. Butcher gave a humorless half-smile. Hate asking, but yes. Because there is no version of this where they stop on their own, Butcher said. Because the people running this world only understand force. And because you are the only thing they have ever looked at and actually feared. The answer was crude but not false. Over the following days they struck facility after facility. Some were abandoned before arrival, their evidence scrubbed. Others became battlefields lit by alarms and emergency strobes where malformed test subjects burst from containment and attacked anything alive. Piccolo saved who he could, destroyed what could not be saved, and carried more anger with him after each site than he allowed anyone to see. Starlight joined them once the scale of the project became clear. Even she seemed shaken by the footage recovered from the labs, by the rows of children in observation rooms being taught to fear green skin before they could speak. Yet still Vought persisted. Because somewhere beneath its deepest layer of secrecy, Hidden behind biometric vaults and armed quarantines, one experiment had succeeded. Not perfectly, not cleanly, not in any way a sane mind would call success. But it had lived. The containment logs from Facility 9 ended in 19 seconds of static, 3 severed emergency transmissions, and an image that Butcher replayed only once. A figure larger than Piccolo, broader through the shoulders, skin dark and mottled as bruised jade, with eyes that burned not with discipline but hunger. It did not move like a guardian. It moved like a creature that had been born in pain and decided the universe should answer for it. When the cell doors failed, the thing did not flee through the obvious route. It tore downward through reinforced levels, slaughtered the armed teams below, devoured unstable chemical stockpiles to stabilize its own mutation, and emerged miles away through bedrock like something ancient forced into modern skin. By the time satellites reacquired it, the monster was already moving toward the surface world with terrifying speed. Project Namek had escaped containment. The first city it touched did not understand what it was seeing. Emergency calls described a green giant tearing through a refinery district in Louisiana, moving faster than helicopters and shrugging off anti-armor munitions as though they were rain. Early footage was shaky and incomplete. Workers ran through smoke while storage tanks burst behind them in waves of orange flame. Then the creature stepped fully into view, and for a moment millions thought Piccolo had changed. The outline was close enough to confuse the frightened eye. Tall frame, antennae, green skin, a power source radiating from deep within the body like a living reactor. But the resemblance ended the moment it lifted a screaming worker and threw him through a wall just to hear the structure collapse. This thing had strength without restraint, instinct without wisdom, rage without purpose. It looked like a guardian carved into the shape of a nightmare. By the second day it had crossed 2 states. National Guard columns deployed and were erased. Fighter jets struck from above and found themselves swatted from the sky by lances of unstable energy. One missile barrage landed cleanly enough to light an entire county in fire. And when the smoke cleared, the creature emerged hotter, larger, and more vicious than before. Something inside its altered body learned through violence. It adapted, fed, hardened. The more force humanity used against it, the more efficiently it metabolized destruction into momentum. Vought tried to control the narrative at first. Foreign attack, unidentified extraterrestrial event. But lies become difficult to maintain when thousands of people are uploading the apocalypse from their phones. Within days, the truth leaked in fragments. Stolen lab footage, redacted budgets, dead scientists. Words like experimental hybrid and unauthorized asset began surfacing in places money could no longer bury. Public confidence did not merely crack, it imploded. The 7 were sent against the creature anyway, because Vought had nothing else. The result was broadcast across every network before censors could stop it. A train struck first, moving fast enough to break the sound barrier over the ruined downtown of a Midwestern city already half evacuated. He ricocheted off the monster's chest like a thrown toy and plowed through a bank facade in a spray of blood and stone. The deep lasted 6 seconds. Black Noir lasted less than a minute. Maeve managed to stagger it with a sustained barrage, only to watch her sword melt in its hand as unstable Kai bled from its skin like venomous light. Starlight, forced into the confrontation before she fully committed to the resistance, burned herself nearly unconscious trying to shield civilians from the crossfire. Then Homelander arrived. The entire world expected the tide to turn. The entire world had been trained to expect that. Instead, they watched the strongest symbol in America discover what it meant to be outmatched by something that reflected his own cruelty back at him. Heat vision scorched the creature's face and only enraged it. Homelander's punches split pavement and shattered buildings, but they never broke the thing's posture. In return, it struck him once in the ribs with enough force to send him through 3 city blocks, then pursued him through the smoke with delighted malice. For the first time on camera, Homelander fled. And still the creature advanced. Piccolo found the aftermath before he found the monster itself. Burned schools, evacuation centers overrun in the rush. Highway medians filled with abandoned cars and the belongings of people who had left home believing they would return in a few hours. The scale of the suffering was already larger than any single rescue could erase. He moved through the chaos tirelessly, carrying the wounded, stabilizing structures, extinguishing fires, and redirecting entire streams of refugees away from projected attack routes. Yet under every action lay a dark and growing realization. This horror existed because his arrival had shown Vought what was possible. He could tell himself that responsibility belonged to the corporation, and morally it did. But conscience is not a courtroom. It does not limit itself to legal boundaries. It asks harder questions. If power enters a diseased system and the system mutates around it, does the innocent bystander remain entirely innocent? Piccolo wrestled with that question while standing above a ruined suburb at sunset, watching families move along the interstate in lines that seemed to have no end. The sky behind them glowed red from distant fires. Children clutched pets, blankets, and plastic bags filled with all that remained of ordinary life. They did not look toward the horizon for superheroes anymore. They looked toward it with learned dread. That was when Piccolo understood the deeper sickness of this world. People here had been trained into helplessness. For years they had been told that salvation would come from above, dressed in capes and trademarks, and that ordinary courage mattered only as audience participation. The result was a civilization spectacularly vulnerable to betrayal. When the idols failed, the public had no cultural memory of standing on its own feet. Fear moved through communities faster than any monster because fear had been rehearsed for profit. So Piccolo made a decision that no one expected from the strongest being on the planet. He began to teach. Not in classrooms at first, but in parking lots, shelters, church basements, warehouse rooftops, and abandoned sports fields where refugees gathered between evacuations. He showed volunteers how to organize perimeter watch rotations without panic, how to move children and the elderly first without collapsing the line, how to identify unstable structures before they fell, how to use simple tools for barricades, signaling, and fire control, how to stay calm when disaster wanted their terror more than their blood. He trained police who still cared, medics running on no sleep, teenagers too stubborn to leave their neighborhoods undefended, mothers who had decided fear would not be the inheritance they handed their sons. At first they followed instructions because he was powerful. Then they kept following because he respected them. He never spoke to civilians as if they were weak. He did not promise that strength would make them invincible. He taught them instead that discipline could make them dangerous to despair. Communities that had once waited passively for rescue now built evacuation maps, supply chains, lookout systems, and defensive choke points. Neighbors who had barely known each other shared generators, food, and guard shifts. In places where panic should have devoured everything, a quieter force began to form. Hope properly organized. Starlight saw it before anyone in the media did. She moved among these communities in plain clothes, helping distribute medicine and power packs, and what she found unsettled her more than all the violence. People were changing. Not because they had found a stronger idol, but because Piccolo refused to become one. He pushed responsibility back into their hands and somehow made that feel empowering rather than cruel. Huey noticed it too. Even Butcher, who distrusted Uplift almost as much as he distrusted superheroes, could not deny the results. Places trained by Piccolo held together longer under pressure. Fewer people died. Fewer panicked. Fewer knelt. The creature, meanwhile, continued evolving. Its path across America grew less random with each attack. It struck infrastructure nodes, supply depots, communications hubs. It was learning strategy, or perhaps inheriting fragments of it from the stolen biology within. Reports from survivors describe moments when it stopped mid-slaughter and stared into the distance as if listening for something beyond sound. Piccolo knew what that meant the first time he felt it. The monster was searching for him. Somewhere inside its ruined existence, some broken echo recognized the original. Their confrontation became inevitable. Homelander understood that too, and in the twisted chambers of his injured pride, inevitability became opportunity. Bruised in body and shattered in reputation, he began reaching out through channels so dark even Vought pretended not to see them. He wanted intelligence on the creature's movement. He wanted analysts to map its aggression patterns. He wanted one thing made clear above all others. Could the monster be turned? The answer came from a terrified research survivor who should have died in Facility 9 but did not. The hybrid could not be controlled by commands, incentives, or loyalty conditioning. It hated its creators too much. But hatred made it readable. Feed that hatred a target. Feed it pain. feed it the image of the being whose cells had become the prison of its own body. Homelander smiled for the first time in days. If he could not dominate the creature, he could align himself with its rage. And so, while Piccolo taught frightened civilians how to stop surrendering their world to fear, Homelander slipped into the ruins like a false prophet seeking a new god to kneel beside. He found the hybrid in the corpse of a steel mill, surrounded by molten beams and half-eaten armored vehicles, and offered it the one language both of them truly understood. Not partnership, not trust, shared hatred. By the time night swallowed the valley, an alliance had been formed between the monster humanity created and the hero it had mistaken for salvation. Civilization does not collapse all at once. First it frays, then it stutters, then it forgets how to pretend it is still whole. By the time the alliance between Homelander and the Project Namekian creature began bearing fruit, America had entered that last terrible stage. The nation still had lights in some places, broadcasts in others, uniforms, checkpoints, press briefings, and emergency seals on official documents. But these had become costumes worn by a body already bleeding out. Highways choked with abandoned vehicles. Local government stopped responding outside limited zones. Hospitals triaged by candlelight when grids failed. Supply chains snapped. In some cities, militias formed from desperation. In others, mobs formed from the same source. Every rumor accelerated panic. Every delay widened it. People no longer asked who would fix the world. They asked how much of it could still be saved. Vought Tower remained standing over New York like a monument to denial. Inside, executives fought for leverage, immunity, or escape routes, while internal servers hemorrhaged years of buried crimes. Whistleblowers surfaced. Asset lists leaked. Contracts, murders, cover-ups, payoffs, child testing programs, and black-budget military deals spilled into the public sphere faster than anyone could contain them. The corporation that had manufactured heroism for profit was being flayed open by its own desperation. Yet even in collapse it remained dangerous, because a dying empire can still crush countless people while its hands go slack. Against that ruin, a strange coalition began to form. It was not built on trust. Trust would have taken years none of them possessed. It was built on converging necessity. The boys brought intelligence networks, sabotage experience, and a lifetime of grudge sharpened into usefulness. Starlight brought public credibility among the frightened, plus access to people inside the collapsing infrastructure who still wanted to help. Smaller groups joined in pieces. Honest police captain, utility workers, transport coordinators. Community leaders who had once existed beneath the attention of the superpowered world and now had no choice but to step into visibility. And at the center of it all stood Piccolo, not as a ruler, not even as a general in the traditional sense, but as something harder to define and easier to follow. A standard. The first strategic meeting took place beneath a shuttered train depot converted into a makeshift operations center. Maps covered the walls. Radios hissed from folding tables. Generators throbbed through the concrete floor. Butcher stood over a layout of eastern seaboard infrastructure with the grim focus of a man planning a burglary against the apocalypse. He had no cape, no shining symbol, no divine aura. What he had was cold tactical intuition and a hatred so long refined it had become a form of mathematics. "They are not rampaging blind anymore," he said, tapping routes marked in red. "They are hurting. Hitting fuel, power, and transport in sequence. Push enough cities into collapse, force the refugees north, jam the military response, then all roads point back to New York. That is where they want the endgame." "Homelander wants a stage," Huey muttered. "He always did," Annie replied. Piccolo studied the map in silence. Butcher was right. The pattern was obvious once stripped of panic. The creature hit like a beast, but the selection of targets carried strategic intelligence. Homelander's influence was all over it. Destruction was being shaped into narrative. Final battle, final city, final audience. "Then we do not wait for them to define the battlefield," Piccolo said. That became the principle of the coalition. Evacuation corridors were redrawn to avoid the routes Homelander expected. Civilian defense hubs trained by Piccolo were linked through radio chains and courier lines so communities could warn one another without relying on compromised networks. Butcher organized sabotage teams to cripple Vought logistics and sever remaining black site support. Starlight coordinated public broadcasts that bypassed corporate channels and spoke to people in the plain language fear had denied them for years. No slogans, no merchandise, no polished lies about everything being under control, only instructions. And the repeated insistence that survival was now a shared responsibility. The effect was slower than spectacle and far more powerful. In neighborhoods once paralyzed by terror, citizens started preparing instead of panicking. Rooftops became lookout posts. Churches became clinics. School gyms became ration centers and training halls. Construction crews repurposed barriers into choke points. Former rivals shared fuel and tools because the fantasy of isolated safety had died with the old order. Everywhere Piccolo went, he saw a new expression emerging in ordinary faces. Not confidence exactly, something sturdier. He found it in a teenage boy who had lost his father during the first week and still volunteered every night at the perimeter because younger children slept better when he was visible. He found it in an immigrant nurse who ran 3 mobile triage sites from a single van while correcting everyone who called her brave. He found it in exhausted electricians reconnecting blocks of housing one building at a time because darkness itself had become a weapon. Humanity, once stripped of the narcotic of corporate hero worship, was revealing enormous buried potential. It had not been weak. It had simply lacked anyone worth following. That realization changed Piccolo more than he admitted. He had always known the value of discipline. He had taught it, suffered through it, embodied it. But this world forced him to see another truth. Sometimes the greatest service strength can offer is not protection alone. It is example. Not carrying people forever, but standing firmly enough that they remember they have legs. Even Butcher began to shift, though no one would ever accuse him of becoming inspirational. He still swore like rage was his religion. He still treated optimism as a contagious disease. But when Piccolo proposed arming certain communities with structured defense plans rather than evacuating everyone into larger panic funnels, Butcher did not laugh it off. He improved the plans, added fallback routes, trap point, kill zones for unstable Vought assets. In another universe, he might have been a general. In this one, he was simply the only bastard alive bitter enough to think clearly while the world burned. The creature attacked Philadelphia on the 7th night of coordinated resistance and found something it had not met before. Prepared civilians, not warriors in the superhuman sense. They could not match it physically, but they were organized. Sirens triggered district by district in time sequence. Barricades funneled its movement away from shelters. High-voltage traps slowed its advance long enough for evacuation columns to clear the western sector. Spotters relayed positions from rooftops with a discipline that would have shamed professional response teams. When Piccolo arrived, there were still casualties. There were always casualties. But there was also a city that had refused to die on its knees. He fought the creature there only briefly, enough to test its new adaptations and drive it back from a hospital corridor packed with children on respirators. The hybrid had become stronger, denser, more cunning. Worse, he could feel Homelander nearby, striking from range, retreating, circling like a cowardly moon around a planet of violence. They were learning each other, coordinating. The final confrontation was near. After the battle, while dawn bled slowly over the broken skyline, Piccolo stood alone atop a ruined courthouse and looked east toward New York. The air tasted of smoke and iron. Below him, the city moved with stubborn life. Volunteers cleared rubble. Medics transferred the wounded. Neighbors who had survived by discipline rather than miracle embraced each other in the street. The sight stirred an old memory in him, of worlds saved not by perfect beings, but by flawed ones who chose courage anyway. Annie approached quietly and stopped beside him. "They are starting to believe they can survive," she said. "They can do more than survive," Piccolo replied. She looked at him then with the mixture of gratitude and sadness reserved for those who arrive too late to prevent the wound, yet early enough to stop the death. "What are you really?" she asked. Piccolo was silent for a moment. "A warrior," he said. "Sometimes a guardian when one is needed." She smiled faintly. This world needed one. By evening, the coalition had confirmed what everyone already sensed. Homelander and the creature were consolidating at Vought Tower. The remaining loyalist assets were withdrawing inward. Broadcast jammers ringed the district. Defensive emplacements lined the upper avenues. It was not merely a fortress. It was a declaration. "Come here," the tower said. "End it where the lie began." So they prepared. Civilians were pulled back to hardened zones. Strike teams checked routes and fallback positions one final time. Butcher distributed explosives with the grim tenderness of a priest handing out last rites. Huey tried not to show how badly his hands shook. Starlight moved among the volunteers, steadying them with the kind of honesty that inspires better than any speech. Above them all, clouds gathered thick and low over Manhattan, darkening the city until Vought Tower seemed less like a building than a blade. Piccolo stepped onto the roof of the Coalition's final staging point and reached for the white cape resting across his shoulders. The garment had been more than fabric. It was weight, training, discipline made physical. Every extra pound, every measured inconvenience, had been part of a promise to remain centered no matter how strong he became. Now, with the last battle approaching, he unclasped it. The weighted cape fell to the rooftop with a heavy thud that cracked the concrete beneath it. Everyone nearby turned at the sound. Piccolo straightened slowly, lighter now, aura whispering at the edges of visibility like restrained lightning. He looked toward Vought Tower, and for the first time since entering this broken universe, he allowed the full scale of his power to rise without disguise. The air around him began to shake. The storm over New York did not break with rain. It broke with power. When Piccolo rose into the night above the Coalition staging point, the pressure of his unleashed aura rolled across the skyline in concentric waves that rattled windows miles away. Streetlights flickered. Clouds twisted open. The dark mass over Manhattan glowed green from within, as though the sky itself had remembered an older kind of wrath. Below, exhausted civilians looked up from barricades, medical stations, and rooftops, and felt something they had not allowed themselves in weeks. Not hope alone. Certainty. Vought Tower answered his ascent with fire. Defense batteries hidden along the upper terraces erupted in coordinated streams of missiles, plasma charges, and rail-accelerated rounds stolen from a dozen black budget programs. Piccolo moved through them like thought. Explosions flowered harmlessly behind him. Energy barriers flashed into being, redirected shells into empty air, and shielded nearby buildings from falling debris. He did not rush the tower. He dissected its violence while advancing through it, each movement carrying the same message he had been teaching since the world began to collapse. Control matters more than force. The first breach came from below. Butcher's demolition teams slammed explosives into Vaught's outer infrastructure, collapsing generator relays, severing elevator shafts, and turning luxury atriums into smoke-filled kill boxes. Huey coordinated entry teams through maintenance tunnels, while Annie led civilian extraction units away from the district in disciplined waves. Inside the tower, alarms layered over pre-recorded corporate reassurance announcements until whole buildings sounded like a machine trying to convince itself it was still immortal. Then Homelander appeared. He emerged from the crown of the tower in a burst of red light, cape snapping behind him, face stripped of every human pretense. There was no television smile left, no polished patriotism. Only naked hatred, sharpened by weeks of public unraveling and the unbearable knowledge that the world had seen through him. He floated at the center of the skyline like a fallen icon refusing the ground. "You did this," he shouted, voice booming across the avenues. "You took everything." Piccolo stopped in the air opposite him. "No," he said. "I revealed what you were." The answer lit the fuse. Homelander attacked with everything he had concealed in their first confrontation. Heat vision lanced across the night in sustained beams fierce enough to cut through skyscrapers. Piccolo met them with layered barriers that split the blast into harmless streams, though the reflected light turned entire cloud banks red as blood. Homelander closed the distance a heartbeat later, fists crashing down with a fury that had lost all resemblance to trained combat. This time Piccolo did not simply evade. He intercepted, deflected, countered. Their blows thundered across Manhattan like mobile artillery, but where Homelander fought from wounded ego, Piccolo fought from clarity. Clarity always lasts longer. Homelander realized that too late. Below them, the tower split open as the Project Namekian creature burst through 30 floors of steel and glass in a roar that shook surrounding districts. It had grown again. The hybrid now towered over even the original frame it had imitated. Muscles plated with dense scar tissue and unstable energy pulsing beneath translucent veins like liquid lightning. Shards of reinforced glass fell from its shoulders as it launched itself skyward, not with grace but with furious inevitability. Its eyes fixed on Piccolo with a hatred so intimate it almost resembled grief. The alliance of monsters was complete. They came at him together. Homelander from the front, the hybrid from below, timed with crude but effective coordination. One drove relentless aerial pressure while the other forced close-quarters brutality, trying to split Piccolo's attention and drown his discipline in overlapping violence. The skyline became a war zone of shattered signage, burning office floors, collapsing drone swarms, and shockwaves that rippled down avenues in visible rings. Yet even in the center of that storm, Piccolo's movements retained an almost meditative precision. He let Homelander overcommit, redirected him into the hybrid's path, and watched them collide in midair with enough force to crack the facade of a neighboring tower. He used the opening to drive a compact Kai burst into the creature's sternum, sending it crashing through the upper half of Vought's executive wing. Before Homelander could recover, Piccolo spun and struck him across the jaw with a backhand so clean it silenced the city for one stunned instant. The false god tumbled end over end, smashing through illuminated billboards that still advertised his own face. But they rose again. Of course they rose again. Because this battle was never going to be won by a single, overwhelming strike. One enemy was fueled by narcissistic rage, the other by engineered suffering. Both drew momentum from pain, and Vought Tower beneath them was still vomiting new threats into the night as automated defenses awakened floor by floor. The battlefield was not only alive, it was ideological. Every corridor represented corruption made concrete. Every shattered conference room held the echo of lives traded for profit. So Piccolo changed the shape of the fight. He descended through the broken upper levels of the tower with his enemies following, and for the first time allowed the full brilliance of his aura to fill an enclosed space. Green light flooded the executive floors. Walls vaporized. Armed loyalists dropped their weapons and fled as pressure shook marble lobbies and ripped propaganda banners from the walls. Homelander lunged from behind. Piccolo ducked, seized his arm, and drove him downward through 7 floors of polished deception into a laboratory archive where Project Namekian research data still burned on failing servers. The hybrid crashed in a moment later, blind with wrath. All 3 vanished into the tower's core. What followed was less a duel than a judgment. Piccolo fought through labs, vaults, and memorial halls built to celebrate manufactured heroes, tearing open the institution from within while shielding lower levels from collapse whenever civilians might still be trapped. Homelander, driven past reason, began destroying his own fortress in the effort to land a decisive blow. The hybrid tore through walls, feeding on unstable reactor leakage and mutating faster each time its body was damaged. One arm became a bladed growth. Its spine flared outward with radiant protrusions that cut through concrete like saw teeth. It wanted to consume Piccolo, to overwrite the original with the agony of the imitation. Instead it met purpose. Piccolo baited both opponents toward the central atrium, a vast vertical chamber lined with giant screens that had once broadcast Vought's mythology to the world. Now those screens flickered with leaked files, employee evacuations, and the live image of the battle consuming the tower itself. Homelander attacked first. The hybrid followed. Piccolo ascended between them, drew his hands together, and let silence enter his mind. When he spoke, the name of the technique carried through the tower like a sentence. Special beam cannon. Light compressed into a spiraling lance at his fingertips, dense enough to distort the air around it. The charging sound rose from whisper to cathedral scream. For a breath, the whole battlefield seemed to narrow around that point of impossible focus. Then Piccolo fired. The beam tore upward and downward at once through the geometry of the atrium, curving by his control rather than natural law. It pierced the hybrid's armored shoulder, severed the mutated bladed arm, drilled through hardened reactor nodes, and split Homelander's attack line before either of them fully understood what they were seeing. The resulting shockwave shattered the giant screens and blew out every remaining window on the eastern face of Vought Tower. But Piccolo had angled the blast with exact mercy. He could have turned that technique fatal. Instead, he used it to dismember the creature's offensive capacity, cripple the tower's power heart, and force Homelander into naked vulnerability without killing either on impulse. The hybrid crashed to the atrium floor, roaring in disbelief as its unstable body began consuming itself around the wound. Homelander slammed into a broken balcony, cape burning, one side of his suit reduced to charred ruin. Below, Butcher and the others reached the public records vault. With the tower failing around them, they unleashed everything. Data archives, blackmail libraries, termination orders, laboratory footage, witness statements, payments to politicians, experimental logs on children and dissidents. The truth burst into global networks like floodwater through rotten wood. Vought's decades of corruption did not merely leak, they detonated. Homelander tried to stand amid the raining sparks and broken marble. He looked less like a god now than a man stranded inside the wreckage of his own myth. Still, he glared upward at Piccolo with the stubborn mania of one who cannot survive self-knowledge and therefore rejects it entirely. "You think this makes you better than me?" he rasped. "No," Piccolo said, descending slowly through drifting ash. "My choices do." Around them, the tower burned, databases emptied, and the world watched the empire of false heroism die in real time. The hybrid writhed, the building failed, and the last mask on Homelander's face finally fell away. With nowhere left to hide, he made one final desperate decision. Section 8, the Guardian Earth never deserved. Word count 1,200. There are men who, when defeated, surrender to truth. And there are men who would rather drag the whole world into the grave than live 1 second beneath it. Homelander had revealed which kind he was long before this night, but now the distinction sharpened into apocalypse. Half buried in the shattered balcony of Vought Tower, body scorched and trembling, he looked past Piccolo toward the exposed reactor systems below. The special beam cannon had crippled the tower's power core without detonating it, but only someone with discipline would recognize the difference. To Homelander, every source of destruction was simply another throne he could die upon. His eyes flicked once toward the self-consuming remains of the Project Namekian creature writhing in the atrium, once toward the emergency fuel reservoirs and unstable soup research caches buried in the lower levels, and then back to Piccolo. "If I cannot have them," his expression said, "no one will." Not at Piccolo. At the heart of the tower, Piccolo understood instantly. A cascade through the damaged core, amplified by volatile compounds and experimental energy reservoirs, could turn the entire district into a funeral pyre. Hundreds of thousands might die before dawn. More if the chain reaction reached neighboring infrastructure. Homelander was not trying to win anymore. He was trying to erase the witnesses. Piccolo moved faster. The chase tore through collapsing levels and streaks of red and green light. Homelander blasted open containment doors with heat vision wild enough to liquefy steel supports. Piccolo redirected the collapsing debris around trapped personnel and fleeing civilians even while pursuing him. Below them, Butcher and the others reached the exposed service levels just as blast doors began dropping from the ceiling. Huey shouted evacuation paths through a half-functioning radio while Annie flooded the darkened corridor with hard white light, guiding trapped workers and injured technicians toward the eastern stairwells. There were still Vought employees running in blind terror, some guilty, some merely complicit, some too small inside the machine to know what they had helped preserve. Piccolo protected them anyway. That was the difference. He did not sort the innocent from the useful by profit margins. He saw lives where corporations saw assets. Homelander reached the reactor chamber first. It was a cathedral built for greed. Cooling pillars towered through the center like metallic organs. Emergency lights pulsed red across glass conduits full of unstable compounds. Deep below, the wounded heart of the tower trembled under strain, one bad decision away from becoming a city-killing sun. Homelander hovered over it, chest heaving, face lit from beneath by the sick glow of failing systems. He looked almost peaceful for a second, as if destruction was the only place he had ever truly felt at home. "You should have let them love me," he said. Piccolo descended into the chamber, aura spreading carefully to stabilize the cracking supports around them. "Love cannot be taken," he replied. "Only fear can." Something in Homelander broke for the last time. He drove both fists into the core housing. The chamber erupted. Energy raced through the columns in shrieking lines. Panels burst. Heat rolled outward. Somewhere above, a dozen floors caved in at once. Annie screamed through the radio for everyone to get clear. Butcher dragged 2 wounded workers toward an emergency bulkhead, while Huey fought a jammed release with bleeding hands. Outside, the upper half of Vought Tower began to shine from within like a lantern made of rage. Piccolo planted himself at the center of the blast radius and raised both arms. The expanding surge struck his barrier and stopped. Not fully, not cleanly. The force of it bowed the sphere inward until cracks of light crawled across its surface. Piccolo's feet tore furrows through the metal floor. Veins rose along his arms. This was not the controlled violence of a duel now. This was catastrophe in its purest form, a death wave trying to turn a city district into memory. Homelander attacked him even then, punching through the edge of the barrier with suicidal fury, trying to force the overload past the only being capable of containing it. Piccolo endured the strike and looked at him with the same unbearable pity as before. "You were given every gift," he said, "and used them to make the world smaller." Then he moved. One hand maintained the barrier. The other struck. The blow was not flashy. It was not theatrical. It carried no scream of triumph, no cruelty, no pleasure. It was simply final. Piccolo drove his fist into Homelander's chest with precise, overwhelming force and sent him backward through the reactor housing into a ring of collapsing conduits. The impact detonated the remaining control lattice around him. Heat vision flared once in a wild, useless burst. Then the false god fell into darkness and did not rise again. But the tower was still dying. Above them, the Project Namekian creature, half destroyed yet not fully finished, dragged itself toward the chamber through burning wreckage. Its body was consuming itself from within. Chunks of mutated tissue sloughed from bone. The stolen power in its cells had become too unstable to survive. Still it crawled forward, not toward escape, but toward Piccolo. Toward the original. Toward the one existence whose disciplined strength had accidentally become the blueprint for its agony. When Piccolo felt it, he lowered his gaze. In another life, under another sky, perhaps this being might have become something more than pain. But it had been made in violation, raised in torment, and taught only violence. There was no future waiting for it beyond further suffering. The creature looked at him, and for the first time its hatred seemed to falter. Not because it forgave him, because it was tired. Piccolo understood. He widened the barrier just enough to keep the reactor stable for a few more seconds, then gathered a final focused sphere of Kai in his free hand. No rage entered it. No vengeance. Only mercy. Rest, he said. The blast was small, clean, and absolute. The hybrid vanished into light. The scream stopped. The chamber stopped shaking quite so violently. One source of catastrophe was gone. The other remained. Through sheer force of will, Piccolo compressed the unstable energy of the core inward, layer by layer, sealing ruptures, redirecting pressure, and burning through his own reserves to deny the city its funeral pyre. The effort would have killed lesser beings 10 times over. Outside the chamber, the tower continued collapsing in slabs and sparks while evacuation sirens wailed across lower Manhattan. Butcher and the others reached the outer platform just in time to look back and see a green sun burning inside the corpse of Vought Tower. Then the light contracted. The explosion that should have erased the district collapsed into a single upward beam that punched harmlessly through the crown of the building and into the storm clouds above. The sky split. Thunder rolled out over the river. For several seconds, the whole city stood beneath a column of green radiance so bright it seemed heaven itself had opened to witness the end of an empire. When the light faded, Vought Tower began its final fall, not outward across the city. Piccolo guided the collapse with the last of his strength, folding the structure into itself floor by floor so that the giant monument to manufactured heroism died where it stood. Steel screamed, concrete thundered. Screens, slogans, statues, laboratories, and executive suites sank into a mountain of ruin that sent dust billowing through the avenues like the burial breath of a dead age. And then it was over. Morning found New York stunned into silence. Smoke drifted between buildings. Emergency crews moved carefully through the wreckage. People emerged from shelters and subway stations expecting another lie, another spinning statement, another hero stepping before cameras to claim the credit. Instead, they found something stranger. Homelander was gone. The Seven were broken. Vought's internal archives were everywhere, impossible to contain now, copied across global servers, mirrored by journalists, whistleblowers, and ordinary citizens who had decided truth belonged to the public. Investigations exploded across nations. Arrests began before the dust had settled. Politicians who had fed on Vought's money started disappearing from television. Families of victims received proof they had been denied for years. Manufactured legends rotted in broad daylight. And amid that collapse, people began rebuilding. Not under one banner. Not beneath a new corporation. Not through worship of a replacement icon. Neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city, they rebuilt the way Piccolo had taught them to survive. With discipline. With shared burden. With courage that did not wait for applause. Community defense groups turned into recovery crews. Temporary clinics became permanent care networks. Supply lines created during the crisis evolved into mutual aid systems no brand could own. Humanity, having looked directly at false gods and lived, no longer seemed quite as eager to kneel. But they still searched for Piccolo. They found him at last on the edge of the ruined harbor 3 days later, standing alone before a newly stabilized dimensional rift that shimmered like still water held upright in the air. Scientists, survivors, reporters, volunteers, and government officials kept their distance, forming a wide, silent circle around the place where the guardian from another world was preparing to leave. Offers came anyway because old habits die slowly. Leadership councils asked him to stay and help guide reconstruction. Military officials proposed global defense roles. Artists had already begun sketching statues. Someone spoke of medals, someone else of monument. The language of worship was trying to return in softer clothing. Piccolo refused all of it. "I did not come here to rule," he said. And guardians do not protect people so they can be worshipped. They protect so others may learn to stand. There was disappointment in some faces, relief in others, and understanding in a few. Butcher approached last. He looked older now, though perhaps he had always looked this tired and there had simply never been enough light to notice. For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved over the harbor, carrying salt, ash, and the strange clean scent that arrives after a storm has finally exhausted itself. "You could stay," Butcher said. "World could use someone like you." "Every world could," Piccolo answered. Butcher gave a dry laugh at that. The kind a man makes when he knows truth has no reason to flatter him. He glanced back toward the city, then forward again. "Suppose there is a lesson in all this," he muttered. "Bloody expensive one." Piccolo looked at him, at the man built from fury who had still chosen, in the end, to help others live rather than merely help monsters die. "Strength means nothing if it exists only for yourself," he said. Butcher lowered his eyes. Perhaps it was the closest thing to absolution he would ever receive. Perhaps it was only instruction. For men like him there was not always a difference. The portal brightened. Starlight stood beside Huey in the crowd, both of them silent. Children who had once been rescued by Piccolo clutched homemade drawings at their sides. Workers removed helmets. Medics paused between shifts. People who had survived not because a hero had sold them safety, but because a stranger had reminded them what courage looked like, watched him in reverent quiet. Piccolo stepped toward the light and stopped once more. He turned back, not to speak to governments or cameras, but to the ordinary people. "This world is not beyond saving," he said. "It never was." Then he entered the portal. The radiance folded inward. The harbor fell still, and the place where he had stood became only empty air and morning wind. Yet absence did not erase him. For years afterward, people would argue over what mattered most. The alien power. The battle above Manhattan. The collapse of Vought. The end of Homelander. But memory has a way of keeping the deepest truth while letting spectacle fade. What Earth remembered in the end was not merely the strongest warrior it had ever seen. It remembered the calm in his voice when children were afraid, the discipline in his hands when buildings fell, the contempt he held for lies, the mercy he showed even when wrath would have been easier. It remembered above all that real guardianship had asked nothing in return. And so the world changed, not because a conqueror remained to shape it, but because a teacher had passed through it for a little while and refused to let it stay asleep. In a world where heroes were manufactured and legends were sold, the greatest guardian was the one who never asked to be remembered.